Cuba and Venezuela denounced the criminal policy of the United States during the 43rd session of the UN Human Rights Council. A Commonwealth observer group has arrived in Guyana in the lead-up to the March 2nd general elections. The British government's new immigration policy has sparked controversy in the United Kingdom. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Havana, Cuba, this is From the South, I'm Katrina Goss. And we begin in Geneva, where this Tuesday saw the second day of the 43rd session of the UN Human Rights Council. Speaking during the high-level segment of the session, Cuban Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez reiterated that US policy towards Cuba represents a massive and flagrant violation of human rights.
The United States has increased the implementation of the blockade against Cuba. This is an act of genocide under the 1948 Convention. It is a flagrant, massive and systematic violation of our people's human rights. As the infamous memorandum of the State Department dated 6th of April 1960 points out, they have tried to reduce our people to hunger and despair. The implementation of unconventional measures to prevent our country from procuring fuel has harmed every field of daily life for our citizens: public transport, education, healthcare, food. The full implementation of the Helms-Burton Act has deepened the extraterritorial impact of this embargo.
And Foreign Minister Bruno Rodriguez stressed Cuba's efforts to develop and prosper despite the US blockade, while adding that the country will present its candidacy to become a member of the Human Rights Council for the 2021-2023 period.
Despite the United States embargo and hostility, Cuba is continuing to build an independent, sovereign, socialist, democratic, prosperous and sustainable nation on the basis of the time-tested capacity to resist and on the basis of our people's creativity. Cuba will continue to live up to its international cooperation commitments in the field of human rights. In particular, we will fulfill our obligations that arise from international instruments in this field. Cuba reaffirms its commitment to the Human Rights Council, and we have decided to present our candidacy to become a member of the Council for the 2021-2023 period.
Meanwhile, Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Arriaza also denounced before the Council the same imperialist policies imposed by Washington against the Bolivarian Republic, as well as other nations.
The Council has repeatedly condemned the coercive measures that have been used, such as economic sanctions, and the Council has been alarmed by the disproportionate and indiscriminate effects of these coercive measures on all of the population, but in particular on women, children, boys and girls, the most vulnerable amongst us. But despite all these affirmations, the governments of the United States and other countries who go along with them continue to implement unilateral coercive measures on ideological grounds with a view to forcing other states to renounce their sovereign rights. They intend to impose their political and economic model and to bring about forced regime changes using these tools as a perverse tool. This is completely contrary to international law, and the idea is to get their hand on the resources of the countries concerned. They put up barriers in access to medication and healthcare, and they prevent countries from using their own means of subsistence. This is criminal. Coercive measures amount in practice to weapons of mass destruction. A systematic attack against our people, which is being waged by the United States authorities in full awareness of the effects that ensue. The social and humanitarian consequences are, in fact, very carefully planned goals which are pursued in order to achieve the unlawful political and economic goals that Washington has set itself.
And Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met with his Venezuelan counterpart Jorge Arias on Tuesday in the context of the Human Rights Council session in Geneva. The Venezuelan Foreign Ministry reported on Twitter that the two diplomats met to boost bilateral relations and to continue deepening mutual cooperation. The two politicians also denounced the impact of US unilateral sanctions on the humanitarian and social situation in Venezuela. Both foreign ministers noted the high level of cooperation between their two countries in international organizations and pointed out that politicizing human rights is unacceptable. And on Tuesday, Lavrov denounced his country's concerns about the fate of the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, as the United States has not responded to a proposal to extend the agreement, due to expire in February 2021.
Unfortunately, in this century, dangers and destructive trends are accumulating, arising from the revived aggressive egocentricity of the foreign jet policy of one state.
Tratado sobre misiles antibalísticos, muy importante para la estabilidad estratégica, fue un duro golpe contra toda la estructura del control de armas, desarme y no proliferación. Últimamente en la política
Washington withdrawal in 2002 from the anti-ballistic missile treaty, really important for strategic stability.
global sus reglas en detrimento de los intereses de los demás países y del derecho internacional.
Was a hard blow against all the control structured over weapons disarmament and non-proliferation.
Se proclaman obsoletos e ineficaces.
And we continue with developments in Colombia, where following the demands made by several Congress members and social organizations, the country's constitutional court revoked norms which limited the president's power to sign peace agreements with armed groups. The move opens a new possibility to directly negotiate with the National Liberation Army guerrilla force. Previously, it had been up to the National Security Council to determine whether an organization fulfilled the requirement to be considered an organized armed group and define the terms and conditions of any peace talks with the government. Analysts consider that this new ruling could help Colombia continue on the path to peace through negotiations between the state and the ELN, which was suspended by President Iván Duque in January 2019. Meanwhile, the Colombian Congress approved the creation of a high-level commission for the prevention and monitoring of attacks against persons in the process of reintegration into civilian life. The decision was adopted by the House Peace Commission following the assassinations of more than 190 former members of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia People's Army. The purpose of the commission is to guarantee the protection of those who were signatories to the peace deal of 2016 who laid down their arms. Likewise, the Commission will seek to prevent and denounce all threats and harassment suffered by former guerrilla members. Turning to Chile now, hundreds of demonstrators gathered outside the venue on the second day of the Viña del Mar International Music Festival. Protesters are rejecting the holding of the festival, which they consider reminiscent of the times of the Augusto Pinochet dictatorship, when such extravagant events were held despite the harsh economic reality facing the country's majority. Widespread anti-government protests have been ongoing in Chile since October. The festival's security has been reinforced, while demonstrators have been repressed by state security forces. And our correspondent in Chile, Paola Dragnet, brings us more on the events there.
Viña del Mar, the so-called Garden City, this city where the well-known Viña del Mar festival is held, which on the one hand invests millions of dollars in this international competition, but which at the same time is the city that today has the most impoverished neighborhoods and extreme poverty, according to a study by the A Roof for Chile Foundation. That is just one aspect of the demands made by the people gathering in the surroundings of the Quinta Vergara, the venue where the festival is held, to protest in the framework of this social unrest. Protesters have been repressed by the police, but the protests have also reached the stage, as artists from Ricky Martin on the opening night to Mon Laferte and national artists have taken this ideological dispute regarding the protests that have been ongoing in Chile for 4 months to the stage. Expectations tonight surround the performance.
Welcome back. And we continue in the Dominican Republic, where the social tension is rising as protesters continue to reject the rescheduling of municipal elections. Now on their 10th day, the protests in Santo Domingo demand the resignation of Julio César Castaños, president of the board, who's accused of being responsible for the suspension of the elections on February 16th. Our correspondent in the Dominican Republic, Daisy Toussaint, brings us more in the following report.
Greetings to you in the studio. Protests continue in the Dominican Republic. After 10 days of demonstrations in front of the Central Electoral Board after the suspension of the municipal elections on the past February 16. The Central Electoral Board and deputies from political parties starting the validation process of ballots from 18 municipalities that will have had an automatic vote in the suspended municipal elections. These electoral areas register 62% of the country's electorate, the equivalent of 4.3 million voters. In addition, pot banking protests are being held in homes as symbols of protest. Last Sunday, February 23rd, opposition political parties held a march in defense of democracy, during which they demanded the resignation of the current government. They marched along almost 4 kilometers, ending in Independence Park, where they demanded guarantees to hold the upcoming elections, both the municipal elections on March 15 and the presidential elections in May. This Thursday, February 27th, a huge protest is expected, as the day marks the commemoration of the Dominican Republic's independence. This is all the information we have for now. Back to you in the studio.
Meanwhile, fears are growing over an increasingly fragile security situation in Haiti after police and soldiers fought a deadly gun battle lasting for hours outside the country's presidential palace. The violence broke out when protesting police officers, some in plain clothes and wearing masks, used the opening of the carnival festivities to stage the latest in a series of demonstrations against poor working conditions and calling for the right to unionize. The clash between the police and military comes in the midst of a long-running political crisis that has seen intermittent mass protests against the government of Jovenel Moïse over a corruption scandal and the contested elections of 2017, the results of which the opposition has never accepted. In response, the authorities announced the cancellation of the carnival, warning of the risk of a bloodbath. Turning to Guyana now, an 11-member Commonwealth observer group has arrived to observe the pre-election, polling day and post-election activities as the country prepares for general elections. Over the next 3 days, the group will continue to meet with key stakeholders, including the Guyana Elections Commission, political parties, civil society, the media, the police, citizens and other international observers. The group's mission is to ensure that all processes are in keeping with Guyana's laws and its regional and international commitments. The group was formed following an invitation from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in November.
To prevail on the rest of the world.
Meanwhile, the ruling A Partnership for National Unity Plus Alliance for Change approved the Guyana Elections Commission's decision to reduce the use of private residences as polling stations, stating it would put the country in a better position for credible elections. The opposition has rejected the move to instead use public buildings or tents as polling stations. Meanwhile, others believe that no party should be pushing for the restoration of a system that caused conflict and doubt amongst the electorate for years.
But with the biggest population. Civic was in the tongue of Latin last.
Reports are in of an indigenous leader murdered in the Tarawa region of Costa Rica on Monday night. Jerry Riviera, aged 23, was helping to defend 13 indigenous families who have been under attack from landowners since they recovered their ancestral lands. The Costa Rican National Front of Indigenous Peoples has accused the government of doing nothing to prevent such attacks. Indigenous communities are supposed to enjoy protective measures, as indicated by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. However, indigenous groups in Costa Rica continue to fight both for their land and their autonomy. The surge in new COVID-19 cases in Iran, Japan and South Korea on Tuesday fueled fears of a pandemic as the virus began impacting Europe. The death toll in Italy has risen to 11, where the outbreak extends from Lombardy and Veneto to Sicily, home to the first case reported in the south of Italy. World Health Organization spokesperson Walter Ricciardi noted in Rome that only 3% of Italian patients have died, and all of them had pre-existing conditions. In Germany, there are now 17 cases confirmed, but no reported deaths. Switzerland has also confirmed its first case of COVID-19. The virus has killed more than 2,600 people in mainland China and infected over 77,000. The situation has worsened elsewhere, with more than 40 deaths reported outside of China. Meanwhile, the US Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said on Tuesday that parents should prepare their children for the possibility of school closures. The CDC said Americans may need to prepare for teleschooling should the virus continue to spread throughout the US. And in other news, NASA's InSight Mars mission has confirmed the planet is geologically active. In its first 10 months of operation, a lander recorded 174 quakes. The mission has revealed a...
Share your feelings, exalt your accomplishments, ensure your reality. Our approach is global and keeps us in tune with the peoples. Caribbean countries also get our signal. With enthusiasm, we will continue to broadcast for them. Because we are Telesur, the news broadcaster from South America and the Caribbean.
Welcome back. And we begin this final section of news in Spain, where protests by agricultural workers against low produce prices and precarious working conditions have mobilised 5,000 tractors and some 16,000 protesters, who have now begun to block 4 main roads in the province of Seville. The demonstrations are part of a national campaign in which rural workers are demanding a future worthy of the agricultural sector. On Tuesday, the Spanish government introduced new regulations on the pricing of food in supermarkets in response to weeks of nationwide farmers' protests over plummeting incomes. Under the new rules, contracts between farmers and the companies distributing vegetables, fruit and meat will have to reflect the cost of production, and final retail prices must be appropriately adjusted. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson presented his new post-Brexit points-based immigration system to the House of Commons on Monday, which puts an end to the free movement of EU citizens and prioritises high-skilled workers. The Conservative government was accused of failing to evaluate the economic impact of the measures, after a report indicated that they will have zero impact on creating more jobs for UK workers. The Labour Party has said that the dependency on some sectors on foreign workers will force the government to make numerous exceptions, making the new immigration policies pointless. Others have warned that 10 months are not enough time for companies to prepare for the end of free movement of EU citizens to the United Kingdom. It is expected that agriculture, gastronomy and nursing services could face difficulties to recruit personnel following the introduction of the new system, which plays up to anti-immigrant and racist rhetoric.
All applicants will need to demonstrate that they will have a job offer from an approved sponsor. The job must be at an appropriate skill level. The applicant must be able to speak English and meet tougher criminality standards and checks.
And in the midst of continued demonstrations, the second day of Julian Assange's extradition trial took place in London this Tuesday. Assange appeared in the dock at the London court on Monday for the first day of the trial, in which he's battling to avoid extradition to the United States, where he faces 18 charges and a jail term of up to 175 years for leaking thousands of classified documents published by WikiLeaks in 2010. Assange's attorney, Edward Fitzgerald, said extradition to an American prison would be the height of inhumanity and cited a medical report indicating the risk of Assange committing suicide. Egypt's former president, Hosni Mubarak, has died at the age of 91 in the capital of Cairo, according to state media. State television announced that Mubarak died at a Cairo hospital where he had undergone an unspecified surgical procedure. Mubarak spent nearly 3 decades in office before he was ousted by the military in 2011, following weeks of protests during the so-called Arab Spring. He was found guilty of complicity in the killing of protesters during the uprising. but the conviction was subsequently overturned and he was freed in March 2017. Cameroon's Constitutional Council announced on Tuesday it was annulling the February 9th legislative elections in parts of the country's troubled Anglophone regions. Meanwhile, Human Rights Watch accused the armed forces of killing at least 21 civilians this month in a region where troops are battling Anglophone separatists. The council said the vote would have to be repeated in Lebialim constituency, a hotspot for violence in the English-speaking southwest region. Another vote will also be held in 10 constituencies in the northwest region, which has seen the worst of the violence during the long-running separatist conflict. And we conclude in Brazil, where Carnival has been a historic act of resistance, dating back to the dictatorship era of the 1970s. Our correspondent Brian Mears visited one of the celebrated street bands known as Blocos in Ouro Preto.
Brazil has thousands of street drumming groups called blocos of all shapes and sizes, formed in neighborhoods across the country, and each one has its own story. This is the story of Charanga de Lata, a small bloco that was formed to protest the dictatorship during the 1970s.
We were a group of workers at the aluminium plant who started playing together during our lunch break, and so we decided to start a bloco.
As union resistance to the dictatorship grew in the late 70s, the bloco began to appear at strikes and protests, always playing along but never singing. Their silent voices were their form of protesting the government's silencing of the workers.
The aluminium plant workers had little time to fraternize together, but they decided to use their days off to hold protests, and this transformed into a kind of voiceless protest.